The year is 1240. The air above the Dnieper River is so cold that it burns the lungs, a biting frost that snaps tree branches like dry kindling. Below the frozen cliffs of Kiev, the ice is groaning, but not from the shifting tides of the river. It groans under the weight of 140,000 horses. Picture this scene. The sun is struggling to rise over a horizon that is black with smoke, and the silence of the winter morning is about to be shattered by the terrifying rhythm of war drums made from human skin. This is not merely an invasion. It is an extinction event. Advancing across the steppe is the Golden Horde, the western army of the Mongol Empire, led by the grandson of Genghis Khan Beta and his master strategist Sabbatai. They have burned their way from the Pacific to the Urals, crushing empires, erasing cities, and turning kings into dust. They are the apex predators of the medieval world, a force of nature that moves with the speed of the wind and strikes with the force of a thunderbolt. But here is what the chronicles often gloss over. As the Mongols stared up at the golden domes of Kiev, they expected another terrified populace ready to capitulate or flee. They expected a chaotic rabble that would break at the first volley of arrows. Instead, they saw something that made even the hardened veterans of the Gobi Desert pause. Standing on the ramparts were not just levies or frightened peasants. They were the Druzhina. These were the elite heavy infantry of the Kievan Rus, warriors who traced their bloodlines and their tactics back to the Varangians, Vikings who had rode down these very rivers centuries before. They stood in silence, their breath misting in the freezing air, their kite shields locked together in a wall of iron and oak. They did not scream. They did not waver. They simply waited. For the first time in thousands of miles, the Mongol storm was about to crash against a rock that refused to move. To understand why this moment was so pivotal, we have to look at the machine of war that was approaching the city. The Mongol army of 1240 was perhaps the most disciplined military force the world had ever seen. They were not a barbarian horde in the traditional sense. They were a complex, meritocratic organization built on speed and terror. Each warrior rode with a string of remounts, allowing the army to cover up to 100 miles a day, a pace that was physically impossible for European armies of the time. Their primary weapon, the composite recurve bow, had a draw weight of over 160 pounds. It could punch through mail armor at 100 yards, and a skilled rider could lose 6 arrows in a minute while galloping at full speed. But their greatest weapon was psychological. The Mongols weaponized fear. Before they even laid siege to a city, they would send envoys with a simple choice: submit and pay tribute or die. If a city resisted, everyone was killed. This binary choice usually resulted in instant surrender. The terror of the Mongol name was usually enough to win the battle before it began. However, the Rus were different. While the political entity of Kievan Rus was fracturing, the martial tradition remained strong. The men defending Kyiv under the command of the voivode Mitro were intimately familiar with the steppes, but they fought with the savage stoicism of their Norse ancestors. The defenses of Kyiv were formidable. The city sat on a high bank of the river, surrounded by earthen ramparts 30 feet high, topped with timber walls and stone gatehouses. But the defenders knew the odds. They were outnumbered perhaps 10 to 1. The crisis began not with a charge, but with a sound. The Mongol army brought with them Chinese engineers and siege experts, masters of technology that Europe had never seen. The defenders on the walls heard the creaking of massive timbers and the snap of torsion ropes. Trebuchets and catapults, constructed on the frozen plains, began to hurl massive stones into the city. For days and nights, the bombardment was relentless. The Mongols did not sleep, and they did not let the defenders sleep. They rotated their troops, keeping the pressure constant, a tactic designed to break the mind before breaking the body. But inside the walls, Ditro walked the lines. He spoke to his men not of victory, but of duty. He reminded them of the shield walls of old, the tactic that had allowed their Viking forefathers to conquer England and France. He tightened the formation. They would not fight as individuals. They would fight as a single organism. The turning point came when the bombardment finally shattered the walls near the Lyadsky Gate. The timber splintered, the earthworks collapsed, and a breach opened up a dusty, chaotic ramp leading directly into the heart of the city. In any other siege, this is the moment of panic. This is when the defenders rout. The Mongols, sensing blood, spurred their horses. Thousands of heavy lancers and light cavalry poured toward the gap, screaming their war cries, expecting to ride down fleeing men. But they didn't find fleeing men. They ran straight into a grinder. As the dust settled in the breach, the Mongols saw it. A dense, impenetrable formation of shields locked rim to rim. Spears bristled from the gaps like the spines of a porcupine. Behind the shield stood men in heavy chainmail, wielding the terrifying two-handed Dane axes capable of cleaving a horse's head in a single blow. The Mongol cavalry, robbing them of their greatest advantages, mobility and range, was forced into a frontal assault. They crashed into the shield wall, and the impact was deafening. But the wall held. For the Mongols, this was a tactical nightmare. Their horses refused to charge into the solid mass of infantry. The riders, stripped of their ability to maneuver, were pulled from their saddles and hacked down in the mud. The Viking-style infantry combat was brutal, intimate, and exhausting. It was a meat grinder. The Rus warriors, fueled by desperation and discipline, fought with a ferocity that stunned the Mongol commanders. Beta Khan, watching from a hill outside the city, reportedly stared in disbelief. His tumens, which had swept across the world, were being chewed up by a few thousand men standing in the snow. The fighting in the breach lasted for an entire day and night. The Mongols would send in wave after wave, climbing over the bodies of their own dead to reach the shields. The Rus would step back, tighten the line, and kill again. The physical toll was immense. Imagine swinging a 5-pound axe for hours on end, dehydration setting in, your muscles screaming, the smell of blood and iron filling your helmet. Yet the Rus did not break. They were buying time, though, for what they likely didn't know. Perhaps simply for their honor. Eventually, the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. The Mongols, having endless reserves, could rotate fresh troops into the grinder while the Rus defenders were whittled down one by one. The shield wall, once solid, began to fray. Vitra, wounded and covered in the blood of his enemies, ordered a fighting retreat. This was another maneuver that required immense discipline. Most armies disintegrate when they turn their backs, but the Rus fell back to the inner city, to the fortified center around the Church of the Tides. The battle transformed from a siege into a savage urban brawl. The Mongols, frustrated and enraged by the resistance, poured into the streets. But even here, the Viking legacy of the defenders shone through. They turned every alleyway, every house, and every courtyard into a killing zone. They fought with knives, with rocks, with broken spear shafts. The Mongols, who preferred open fields, found themselves in a claustrophobic nightmare, clearing the city house by house against men who refused to surrender. The final stand took place at the Church of the Tides. The last surviving defenders, along with hundreds of civilians, barricaded themselves inside the stone cathedral. It was the last sanctuary. The Mongols, unwilling to storm the heavy doors and lose more men to the axes waiting inside, brought up their battering rams. They hammered at the walls of the church. The structure, weakened by the battle and overloaded with people seeking refuge on the roof, began to crack. In a final tragic crescendo, the walls of the church gave way. The roof collapsed, burying the last of the defenders and the civilians in a tomb of stone and rubble. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of battle. Kyiv had fallen. The mother of Rus cities was no more. But in the aftermath, a strange scene played out, one that reveals the true impact of this battle. The Mongol commanders sifted through the piles of bodies, looking for the man who had orchestrated this defiance. They found Dmitro, battered, bleeding, but alive. By the laws of the steppe, a leader who cost the Khan so many men should have been executed in the most painful way imaginable. But Beta Khan did something extraordinary. He looked at the wounded voivode and saw a reflection of the warrior spirit the Mongols prized above all else. Bata spared his life. He reportedly told his generals that a man who fights with such courage deserves to live. This was a rare, grudging respect, a recognition that these Viking descendants were a different breed of enemy. The Mongols had won, but the victory was ash in their mouths. The Battle of Kiev had cost them time, resources, and thousands of their best warriors. It shattered the myth of their invincibility in close-quarters combat. While the Mongols continued their advance into Poland and Hungary, the ferocity of the Rus resistance had sent a ripple of fear through their ranks. They learned that in the dark forests of the West, there were men who would not run, men who would stand in their shield walls and look death in the eye without blinking. The moral of this story is not about winning. History is often written by the victors, and on the map, the Mongols won. But the human spirit is not measured in territory conquering. The defenders of Kiev teach us that there is a victory in resistance itself. To stand firm when the outcome is inevitable, to hold the line against overwhelming odds, is the ultimate assertion of human dignity. They prove that you can kill a warrior, you can burn a city, but you cannot extinguish the courage of a people who refuse to kneel. The Mongols terrified the world, but for a few bloody days in December 1240, the world terrified them. If you want to uncover more lost chapters of history, the battles that shaped our world and the warriors who fought them, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell. We are digging up the past, one story at a time.